right, well, good morning, everyone.
Come on.
Welcome to the Center for Creativity. If you're watching on the live stream, we are so happy you are here. My name is Anina Collier. I'm the Dean of the Center for Creativity. And this is our last Fall I Can't workshop. I can't believe it. I know, right? But don't worry, we have plenty of things going on until the I Can't series starts up again next year in February. And one of those things is Monday night. So Monday night, if you've been here, you've heard me talk about this before. We're having a multi-instrumentalist from Nashville named Rory Hoffman. He's going to be here at 5:30 for a performance, demonstration, Q&A. He is here with our Please Touch the Art programming sponsored by the TCC Foundation. And he's like a musical genius who's taught himself to play just about everything, including instruments that he's invented, and he's totally blind. And so we're really excited to have him here Monday at 5:30. You don't have to pre-register or anything. We've got some flyers on the table, so take some and tell your friends. And then I know if you've been here before, you've heard me talk about this. So Tulsa Achieves. This is 2 years of free college for every young person that graduates in a Tulsa County high school, private, public, or home school. They only have to have a 2.0 GPA. And this is an incredible opportunity to get an associate's degree without incurring any debt. We all know how damaging that can be. And these degrees also transfer very easily to four-year institutions. A lot of times people are like, what's the catch? What are the strings? There is no catch. This is just an amazing opportunity that Tulsa has come together to bring for its young people. So if you have a young person in your life, if you are a young person, make sure to grab one of these on the way out and just get it on their radar, even if they're little. Middle school, elementary school. The parents are probably already worried about how to play for college. So let's help get the word out about this. We've got that on the table as well. Also, finally, keep an eye on your email for a film screening and art exhibition with Lauren Waters, a filmmaker. That'll be the first Friday in November. We're really excited about that. So we will keep the programming going, even though this series has come to an end. Now, I am super excited about this workshop. You all know it's pastel painting, and our instructor is really kind of a celebrity in the art world. He may tell you a little bit about that. He's exhibited on Canyon Road in Santa Fe and many other places. He just got back from an arts camp or an arts workshop he was teaching in North Carolina. He also happens to be the vice president of campus and academic operations. Is that right?
Associate Vice President.
Associate Vice President, thank you, here at the college. And he is donating his time today to teach this workshop. So please help me welcome Dr. Greg Stone.
Thank you, Anina. She has to say nice things because I'm her boss. In all fairness. Thank you, Anina. Appreciate it. And I see several familiar faces and fellow co-workers and some former co-workers. Kay, good to see you. So there's a lot to get through in 45-ish minutes. How many of you have ever painted with pastel before? Anybody? A couple of people? Kind of. A few more hands than I suspected. That's really good. How many of you have no flippin' clue what pastel is? That's fine too. Okay, so on your tables, you don't have to dig through them now. I do want to say this before we get started doing some mark making and painting a little bit. I've got some gloves up here if you would like to wear gloves. Let's talk about what pastel is first. And I've got my plein air set up here. I'm a plein air painter as well, which means I paint from life outdoors on location, as long as it's not too windy or too hot or too cold, because I'm a baby and I want to be comfortable, because I'm middle-aged and I don't want to do things anymore that are uncomfortable. But when the weather's really nice, I love to get out and paint. This is a box that contains some, and I'll pass the gloves around in a little bit too. Some of my pastel sticks that are similar to what's on your table. What we chose for today was a brand called Rembrandt, named, because of Rembrandt. No explanation needed on the name. But those are slightly harder sticks than some of what I have here. I'm not going to tilt this up because they would all come crashing down on the floor and break, and I would invent new curse words in front of people. So I don't want to do that. But what pastel is as a medium, I've just got a little stick here, and I'll color-wise, you may not be able to tell on the screen. It's a nice bright purple color. It's about a 1-inch long stick. It is not chalk, and pastelists will get a little fussy if you refer to this as chalk. It looks like chalk, it dusts like chalk, but it is not chalk because it does not contain, anybody? Chalk. Pastel is actually the fine art medium that contains the purest pigment. So it is the same pigment that's in oil paint, acrylic, that's used for watercolor, but it's in a dry form. And it's mixed with some kind of binder like a gum arabic, a little bit of binder, a little bit of distilled water to make a really thick paste. That's then rolled by hand into shapes like this or put into molds and then allowed to dry. And so you have a dry application of pigment. That's what the pastel medium is. So even though oil painting is and always will be king, same pigment. And so you can use pastels in a variety of applications. Now, even though it is a stick that you can hold in your hand and you can use it as a drawing tool, it's really a painting medium because it is not charcoal or graphite or something you draw with, it's pigment. And so even though we apply it in a dry form, most pastelists still think of it as a painter's medium, but you do have the ability to draw and do some fine lines. I'm not gonna pass this around, but I did bring a painting with me. There's something I did fairly recently that you're welcome to come and take a look at before you go. I'll kind of hold it up a little bit. Oh, that's what I was hoping you'd say. Thank you. Just a winter scene that I did. I am something of an impressionist. I'm kind of on that impressionist realist continuum of sorts. But this is all soft pastel applied with the side of the stick. I would hold it up under the camera, but it's not going to show well on the screen. It's just a vibrant medium, and one of the reasons it's so vibrant is because those pigments in crystal form, when you apply them to a sanded surface, and you've all got some sanded paper in the middle of your table, just reach over and feel the sanded surface. This is an archival surface. It's acid-free, so it's not like hardware store sandpaper, but when you drag the pastel across the sanded surface, it adheres to the paper, which you can mount to a board if you would like. I usually mount mine onto a panel before I start painting. It's just easier to frame afterwards. But those pigments, if we were to take a microscope and look at the pigments, they would look like crystals, and you would see how they reflect light. And so when you see a pastel painting that seems really vibrant, or you've got some sticks of soft pastel that just seem really vivid and almost glow, it's because they kind of are. As long as you don't crush those crystals and overblend them, it's actually reflecting a little bit of light back at you. And so that's why pastel is really popular with a lot of folks, because it is so brilliant and vibrant, or at least it certainly can be. This is obviously mostly in shadow, but it just helps make that glowing effect, even better. So, because it is pigment, I will say it does have the ability to stain. That's why there are cloths on the table. Once we start painting, I've got some gloves if you'd like to wear some gloves. I have a product called Gloves in a Bottle. Anybody who does any kind of art or craft project may like Gloves in a Bottle. It's a barrier cream, like a lotion. Rub it on your hands, especially on your nails and cuticles. It will keep your manicures nice and clean from paint pigment. Nothing toxic in these materials, so if you do get it on your hands and you just don't want to wear gloves, you really want to get into it today, that's fine. It may not wash off right away, Lee, but eventually it'll wash off. After a couple of, day or two, there are worse things. But anyway, I'll pass that around when we need to. A little bit about the history of pastel. It is an old medium. It has gone through a bit of a renaissance in American art since the 1970s, and with the founding of the Pastel Society of America. There are lots of organizations across the country. It's becoming more and more popular in the plein air painting movement, but pastel actually goes all the way back to our friend, Mr. Da Vinci. who painted in pastel some. A number of the Impressionists in the late 18th and early 19th centuries really started another movement of pastel. So Degas, Monet, some of those folks whose names you're familiar with, yes, were oil painters, often also painted in pastel, and sometimes would do plein air studies in pastel as well. And then you get into the early 20th century and folks like Mary Cassatt and Child Hassam and all sorts of folks who are also painting in pastel. I like it because I am impatient. I am not lazy, but I am impatient. And while I'm also an oil painter, there are times when I am not in the mood to clean a brush. I don't want to clean up after I'm done. I don't want to scrape my palette down. I just want to sort of walk away from it. And pastel's great for that because it's already dry. It's not going to dry out. I have trays of these sticks in my studio at home, and when I'm done, I just walk away, and I don't have to clean up or anything. No one cares, but that's one of the reasons I like this medium. You can just walk in and walk out, and no big deal. So what I thought we'd do today is talk a little bit about some of the varieties of materials that are out there. I'll tell you a little bit about what I use. We're obviously not going to have time today to do complete paintings or to do a demo. Cheap plug, I often teach pastel painting at Waterworks. Has anybody ever taken a class at Waterworks? Waterworks is Tulsa Parks Department's art center. It's in the old Waterworks plant down on Charles Page Boulevard, just west of downtown. It's a great facility. So in the I Can't series, if you've been introduced to some sculpture, pottery, painting, drawing, there are all sorts of classes that Waterworks offers through the city's Parks Department, and it's a great program. So if you want to get a little more about pastel painting, feel free to take a look at that. So what I thought we'd do today is just to practice some basics of mark making. We obviously don't use brushes. We just apply the stick by hand. When I pick up a stick of pastel that's about 1 inch long, I just use it and think of it as though I have a 1-inch paintbrush in my hand. But I'm just applying the strokes with my hand. And there are all sorts of different kinds of marks that you can use to get different effects, many of which I used for the painting that I brought in today. Sometimes you're painting on the full side of the stick, sometimes you're rolling on the edge to get certain line effects, or you're doing some tapping to leave some marks, but all in all, it's a really fun medium to play with, so I'm excited so many folks were here today. And if you really came for the clay thing that's after this, just pretend, I'm gonna pretend you really came for this part and not the second part, all right? So, in front of you on the table, you have 8 or 9 different pastel sticks from the company Rembrandt. If you, once you start to handle them, you'll find out they feel pretty hard, and they're a harder version of a pastel. Different brands have different textures and hardness and softness to them. They're all called soft pastel as a medium to distinguish them from oil pastels. Some of you may be familiar with oil pastels. That's basically oil paint in stick form. This is not oil pastels, and the mediums are not easily blendable. I suppose if you're really inventive, you can figure out a way to use both in the same painting, but it's going to be like mixing oil and water. It's probably not going to work too well. This is soft pastel, but there are harder soft pastels, and the ones that are on the table in front of you are slightly harder. That means they have a little more binder than some of the softer pastels. It also means they will dust less because you are going to be applying them to a sanded surface, so it's going to produce some dust. Now, like I said, these materials, actually, Cindy, if you wouldn't mind, I've got some medium gloves and some large gloves, and then if somebody wants to use this gloves in a bottle, you only need about like a dime size. It doesn't take a lot. I only brought like 1 bottle, so hopefully between this and the gloves, and again, if you don't want to use them, that's fine. You don't have to. Just make sure you're not, doing this before you go out to lunch or wiping it on your clothes. There's some napkins in the back along with snacks, so help yourself with that. Even though the materials are not toxic, if you are painting, and I will say this, just because of the nature of this workshop, you're all going to be sort of having your paper down. Most folks who paint will paint on an easel so that whatever you're dusting falls down into the easel tray. It's fine to paint flat with pastel, but you're going to potentially, depending on how much you apply, you're going to see on your paper, or maybe that gets on the tablecloth, some dust. That is still paint pigment, so it still will stain, so be careful. And the tendency is to blow it off. Don't blow it off, because even though it's not toxic material, it doesn't belong in anybody's lungs. And so once you blow it around, it gets airborne, and people are breathing it in. And we don't need that in our lungs. So resist the temptation to blow it off your paper. If you get some buildup as we go, just take your paper and kind of tap it against the table and let the extra dust just fall onto the tablecloth, okay? So you've also got, as you start to kind of pass some things around, there are various shades of paper, just like there are many different brands of pastels, there are many different brands of papers. This is a paper out of Australia called Art Spectrum, which is really nice, comes in all sorts of different colors. So for the purposes of today, it doesn't really matter what color sticks that you use or what color paper you use. What we'll do is spend about the next 5 or 10 minutes, just I'll sort of demonstrate and have you sort of make some marks along with me just to sort of see what you can do with it. And then there are also some photocopies of some photographs on your table that if you wanted to, in the remaining 15, 20 minutes, just sort of practice doing a little flower or a piece of fruit or something from a still life photo that's on the table. Okay? Sound good? All right. So I'm going to come up here, and actually I'm going to quickly take my box off the tripod so I can work with it at the table. There are, like I said, lots of different brands of pastels. You can use them, you can intermix them. I have several different brands here in this box. And there are some companies, hopefully you're all familiar with Ziegler's. Ziegler's, it's great to have a local art store like Ziegler's in town. They do carry some pastels, not a lot. My mission is to get so many people in the Tulsa area painting in pastel that Ziegler's will have to carry more. Different brands, more artist-grade brands, but they do have some stuff, and there's some great companies in the country that carry a lot of pastel material, so it's easy to find materials. So what I'm going to do is just kind of walk you through some different marks that you can make with your sticks. Just have you kind of explore them a little bit. I'm going to slide a glove on just to protect my fingernails a little bit. So you can take any stick, and you'll see that the ones I have are different shapes. Some of them are squares that I've broken in half. Some are longer and round. Some are a little shorter and round. Again, they're just different brands, and as you use them, they obviously kind of wear down a little bit. So I'm going to take, even though it may be hard to see, I'm going to take this nice bright purple color. And the first thing I'd like you to do, again, if you want to put on a glove or get some of the gloves in the bottle, that's fine. The first thing is just to take your stick, and I generally will hold it, depending on the size of the stick, with at least 3 fingers, or two fingers and a thumb. Sorry, got to get it in the, there we go. And just so you've got some control on it, you don't want to crush it. Don't put a lot of pressure on it, even though the ones you're using are pretty sturdy. There are some that are really, really soft, and if you really put some pressure on them, they'll just crumble. So don't do that, but just have a firm grip. And then the first thing I want you to do is just sort of practice taking your stick and just, without putting a lot of pressure on it, just dragging it down on the sanded paper. And just get some swatches of color. And if you want to, you can, I know my big hand's in the way, but if you just kind of take it, put it on the paper, slide it around a little bit. And you'll notice how that sanded paper picks up the pigment. And again, how rich that pigment is, depending on the color of stick you're using. Some of you have a few grays that, even though they're not exciting colors, are still nice, rich pigments. And you'll notice, too, if you can see closely, you can still see a little bit of the paper coming through, which is good, because you want to apply pastel with a light touch, because part of what we get to do with pastel is to layer. We don't blend paint the way that oil painter or acrylic painters do, right? If I'm painting with oils and I need a certain warm green, I can take some green out of a tube, and if I need to warm it up, I can add a little yellow ochre to it, or I can add something to it, right? And mix it together with my palette knife or with my brush and adjust the color. Well, you can't do that with pastel, but what we can do is layer them. So I could take this color, and then I could go in and, let's say, take a blue of a similar value. And because I've not filled in the tooth of this paper, meaning you can still see a little bit of the paper through, I can take this color and just glaze right on top of it. And I suddenly turn that nice violet color a little bluer. So that's often in pastel how we mix color, is by visually blending them, just layering them one on top of each other. And so it's important to use a light touch and to not scrub too much, because if I take this original stick that I was using and really apply it heavy, you'll see that it's much more solid. You can't see the paper through it, and I run the risk of filling up the tooth of this paper. You can blend with your fingers, and every once in a while, to soften an edge, I do. That's a really good question, and some folks do, right? And there are all sorts of rules about painting. One of the painters I really love the most, he's a contemporary artist named Richard McKinley. He's a great teacher, currently the president of the International Association of Pastel Societies. Richard often says, you can't break the law, but you can break the rules. So, yes, you can finger blend. But one of the things you do when you finger blend is you crush those little crystals, and they don't reflect nearly as much light. So a lot of excess blending sometimes will make your painting look a little dull. But there may be some times when you need to do that for an effect. Good question. But again, the sanded paper only has so much tooth to it. And after putting so much pigment on it, you fill up the tooth of the paper, and then the pigment's just going to sit on top and not adhere and kind of become a muddy mess. So it's really important to practice using a really light touch. So go ahead and just make a few more strokes on part of your paper, maybe on one half of it. Just kind of feel the tension of the surface kind of grabbing onto that pastel as you slide it across the paper. And I could go again over that blue with some of this purple. I could add some green. If I wanted to turn it green, if I wanted it to be a little more of a warmer brown, I can take that color and again layer that on top and just get some really interesting blended color only by just layering them softly together, not actually taking my finger and scrubbing it. You're not going to be able to see this too well on the screen because it's just not quite bright enough, but I'll leave this up here, and if you want to take a look at it, if I were to take my finger and just rub it into half of this as though I were mixing all those together, it's going to be much duller and muddier than if I just naturally let those pigments sit on top of one another. Again, kind of hard to see on the screen, but if you want to come take a look later, you certainly can. But that's what happens when you do a lot of finger blending or take a paper stump and do some blending. So, basically we call this scumbling, taking a pastel stick and just sort of glazing it. Some people refer to it as glazing, just on top of the surface. But you can do other things as well. Why don't you take that round stick and turn it up on its end, on the round end, and put it down on the paper and just roll the end around a little bit, varying the pressure that you apply it with, sometimes pushing down a little harder, sometimes just barely letting it touch the surface of the paper. And you can get all sorts of little textural effects that sometimes I'll use for tree limbs or bits of grass in a field. Obviously, probably not using this purple color, but I wanted to choose something you could see on this light paper. Just take it and roll the edge of the stick around a little bit between your fingers, just lightly. Let it kind of dance around a little bit, making some lyrical lines. That's a mark that often we will use in pastel painting. You could also take that hard edge and on the edge, again, rolling on the edge, draw some lines. And notice that the softer the stick, the thicker those lines are. But if you want to make some fence posts, knock yourself out, you can do it this way. A lot of the trick to pastel painting is pressure. How much pressure are you using? If you vary your pressure in all of these different marks you're making, you can actually achieve some variations in those marks. If I wanted to really make some of these lines close together, I could do some hatching or cross-hatching. That may be a term you're familiar with. It's really hard with a soft pastel because the lines get so thick, but I could still do it. I could fill in a surface by hatching or cross-hatching. Easier for me to use a somewhat harder stick, although I don't know that I have one with me up here, so that's okay. But I could do some hatching or cross-hatching, put those marks as close together as possible. And again, I could take another color and introduce it as well through some hatching or cross-hatching. And the further you get away from it, it'll blend together. But close up, you get some of that detail and some of that interest. I always like to give people something interesting to find in my painting the closer they get to it. You could also take a stick of your pastel and just kind of hit the edge on the paper. Just kind of make some random dots. And depending on the edge of the paper, depending on the edge of the pastel stick, you get random sized little dots. Some people paint animal portraits, pet portraits, or bears or mountain lions or trouts, right? And pastel often, and you can get some interesting textures of fur on an animal or skin on a fish or on a bird by making some of these kinds of little dabby marks, right? You can also just take the length of the stick and just hit it down on the paper, just sort of make contact with the stick. Now you'll notice with my stick, I'm not getting a solid line. And that's because I have an uneven stick. I have a stick that's been rolled by hand. But if you've got something that's been more machine manufactured, like the Rembrandts on your table, you might get a little bit more of a solid line in there. And again, depending on how much pressure you put, you can kind of get a different effect. Sometimes you can get some broken lines, or if you really push hard, you can get some solid lines. So lots of different kinds of marks. And really one of the best things to do is just to get a stick of pastel and just challenge yourself to see how many different kinds of marks you can get based on what part of the stick you use, how much pressure you're using, what kind of paper surface you're using. I could take the stick and literally kind of roll it like a rolling pin back and forth. Anything that applies pressure to the pigment and puts it on the page. All these are different ways that we make marks. And again, this is about a 1.5 inch, maybe 1.25 inch stick of pastel. So I can just think of it as being a 1.25 inch paintbrush. And the handle is my arm. So you've got a lot of control. Try to move your shoulder when you're painting, especially if you're painting in an easel, not moving your wrist or your fingers. You want nice loose marks. But lots of different marks you can make. You can just sort of do little rolls of the edge around, all kinds of things. And by using all these different types of marks, then we can build paintings, whether it's a landscape painting or a portrait or a still life or something that's abstract and non-representational. You can do all sorts of things. There are all sorts of painters who use pastel as a regular medium. What do you think? Good so far? All right. We've got 15 minutes left. So I just want you to play. And I'm going to wander around. And again, if you just want to randomly make some marks, or if you want to take one of the photos at your table, or if there's a photo on your phone and you want to try to paint a little bit of something, again, just you're welcome to, however you approach painting. This isn't necessarily a how to paint workshop, but if you just want to play around and use it as a drawing tool, if that's how you're comfortable, please do. Or if you want to use it as a painting tool to try it out, please do that too. Not everybody has 8 people at your table, so there's maybe a few extra sheets of paper, so share those around a little bit. share the pastel sticks, and just have some fun for the remaining 15 minutes or so. And I'll walk around and answer any questions you may have. And then we'll have just a quick minute at the end to wrap up. All right. Enjoy. Some of you have darker paper, darker tones, and those can be fun to work on. You could take the same pastel stick and use it to paint on 3 or 4 different surfaces and get 3 or 4 different versions of what you're working on. So often the surface has a lot to do with it too. I'll say too, while you're working, just to talk, because I talk a lot. And let's be honest, I'm kind of in charge of the building, so who's going to stop me, right? If we're being honest. You actually can use some wet applications with pastel. You could put a thin layer of pastel on as a first layer of a painting and take a brush with some isopropyl alcohol or water. I found out once vodka works in a pinch, just anything liquid, and liquefy the pastel, and you're basically making wet paint. And you can use a brush to move it around. And in fact, this painting that I did here, that I showed you earlier, was done on a white paper, but I used watercolor to do an initial wash on the paper, so that these dark trees, if you look closely, you'll still see some of the watercolor. I used a Payne's gray, that really lovely, cool blue-gray, to do the initial shape where the trees were, and a much lighter wash of Payne's gray where the snow is, and then let that dry for a couple of minutes, and then apply the fresh pastel on top. You can also use really thin washes of acrylic paint, really thin washes of oil paint. If you want to take some oils and your Gamsol or whatever solvent you're using to really thin it out, make it thin like ink. You could use acrylic inks and sort of put in something on the underpainting and then put dry pastel on top of it once it dries. So you can actually do some really inventive things with wet applications as well. And not every pastel paper, but most pastel papers will accept wet applications. So there's really a lot you can do. But since we didn't really have time to do underpaintings today, we just jumped in to just put an initial layer of dry pastel on, which certainly is a very effective way to paint as well. We've got about 6 or 7 minutes left. Anybody have any questions that I can pretend to answer? Yes? Oh, thank you. The question was, how much time did I spend on this snow scene? I tend to work pretty small. So this is an 11 by 14. I usually work 9 by 12, 11 by 14, 12 by 16, because I like to get the painting sort of mostly done in one setting. It's a way that I keep from letting things get too muddy and out of control. Nothing wrong with going slowly. I just tend to paint pretty quickly. So a scene like that, 2 or 3 hours, I can get that done. And if it looks like, wow, there's so many more details, how'd you do that? Like, that's kind of the point, so thank you. I like to have a little bit of that mystery and serendipity with an underpainting that often gives a sense of there being more details than there actually are. But I usually, in 2 or 3 hours, could do a painting about that size. And then what I might do is just let it sit on the easel, come back to it the next day. If something jumps out at me, I might adjust it. But otherwise, I consider it finished. So. Oh, I'm glad you asked that. Anita's question was, what if you make a mistake? Can you fix it? Absolutely, yeah. Sometimes fixing it's a little trickier than others, but for one thing, it's just pigment and paper. So it's nothing to be afraid of. And if something goes wrong, and something sometimes does, you've got a number of ways that you can fix it. What I could do is I could take, let's say I'm painting something and I've got too much pigment on the surface. I could take it outside. I wouldn't want to do this inside in a closed space. I could take it outside and take a stiff bristle brush and just brush it off the paper into a trash can, preferably not onto the ground because it's pigment, doesn't belong on the ground, but you know what I mean. You could try to knock off as much as you can, and then you could take some, you could either just go right back into it, or you could take some rubbing alcohol or water and just kind of take a brush and wash it down, let it dry. You're never going to get back to the same original color of the paper, but you will have restored the tooth of the paper and you could paint over it. I have sold paintings. I have had paintings accepted into exhibitions. I've won awards with paintings that were painted on top of something else that was a failure. So the materials are a little pricey. Had a question over here about cost to the paper. Sometimes a sheet of this paper could be $1.50, $2 per sheet, and you're thinking, wow, I could mess that up and just waste money all over the place. But if you have really good materials, don't throw it away. You can reuse it. There are certainly ways to do that, and if you just do some simple searches on YouTube. There are a lot of pastel painting videos on YouTube, and you can see all sorts of different tricks people have come up with to salvage their paper and to be able to reuse it. So it's never much of a waste. So that's a good question. Yes, sir. Do you spray fixative? You can. I generally prefer not to. A lot of the brands of fixative tend to sort of spurt out, and you can get little dots and dribbles on your pastel painting. There are a few brands that the fixative is more of a soft mist, and that lays a little better. I try not to use a really heavy hand to have a lot of layers where the pastel would dust off. That is one thing I'll say about framing a pastel painting. You do have to frame pastel paintings under glass. Some people don't know that. Because even though it's dry, if I didn't have glass on this painting up here and I just put my hand on it and did this, I would smudge it all and ruin it. So you do have to frame them under glass. And most folks will use spacers if they frame themselves, or if they take it to a framers like Ziegler's. They'll certainly know how to frame a pastel painting. It's a little risky to put the painting right up against the glass, but as long as you don't move it, you can do that. What was your original question? I forgot. Fixative, thank you. But one of the ways you can help keep the pigment particles from falling off and attaching to the inside of the glass is to spray fixative on it. That's kind of a personal choice, but I generally do not use fixative. I try to paint with a light enough hand that I don't have so much on the surface that it probably is not going to risk coming up. And then I don't have to risk darkening it. Sometimes when you use spray fixative, it kind of darkens the painting too. So, yeah. We have time for maybe one more question. Great, because I was tired of answering them. I'm just kidding. Thank you all so much for coming today. Anina, thank you and Cindy and everybody who helped set up. Appreciate it. Hope this was a nice little first-time introduction or reintroduction. Yes, question.
So you spoke about the classes at Waterworks. Are those free like these workshops?
No, they're not. Yeah, there is a price for those workshops. Some of them are 3 or 4 weeks, one night a week, or a full day Saturday, things like that. Still a really affordable way that the city offers, but definitely not free like I can't.
That's right.
But if you want a little more, it's a great way to go, for sure. Oh, that's my timer.
He is running on time.
Right on time. Thank you all
let's
again.
Let's give
Appreciate
Dr.
it.
Stone one more round of applause. Thank you so much. It was I got to do it too. It's really fun to experiment with this different medium that most of us probably haven't had a chance to before. So, as most of you know, we have another workshop starting in about 15 minutes. It's sculpting. If you registered, of course, we have a spot for you. If you didn't and you want to stick around, we'll just wait and see. I think we'll probably be able to work you in.